Another new feature in this release is Service Level Agreements. This is often abbreviated as SLA. An SLA can help ensure your organization meets service levels when providing support. For example, you can have an SLA to complete the first customer response within a certain duration after case creation, and resolve that case within a specified duration. SLAs can help define these service levels. You can also define actions in case these service levels are not met. You can trigger various actions such as updating the record automatically, sending an email to the case owner and their manager, or assigning the case to a different queue for escalation. The table and graphics shown on this slide show an example of the types of SLAs you can define and how the SLAs can be different depending on criteria such as the customer type or case priority. This also shows how you can trigger actions to warn when an SLA is nearing expiration or when an SLA has expired. I'm going to demonstrate how to create and use an SLA. First, I'm going to navigate to Settings, and within Settings, I'll access Service Management. Here I can see Service Level Agreements. I'm going to click New. First, we need to create this SLA record before we can create the SLA details. This is basically the parent record for all the different SLA details that go along with this SLA. So first I need to provide a name. This next field is important and can't be changed once you've created this record. You can see it defaults to created on, but it gives you an option to choose any of the different date time fields available on the case entity. And this goes along with the SLA details you'll create later. So for example, you might create an SLA detail for first response by that should be that you want to fulfill the first response within the first 2 hours after that case was created. So if you say 2 hours, it'll be from the time of the case creation. If I switch this to escalated on, and that's another date time field on that case record, if I chose first response by, that would be 2 hours from the escalated on date. So whatever you choose for the time duration is calculated based off of what you have set for this option here. So typically you might use created on, but there are options to choose any of the other date and time fields. Then I'm going to click Save. So the record is saved now, and you can see that the applicable from field cannot be modified. The next field that we haven't talked about yet is business hours. We'll talk about this in a later section when we talk about customer service schedule, which is another new feature. So without setting this option, it's going to assume that you have 24/7 support. So if you have a first response time of 2 hours, no matter what time that customer opens up that case, it's starting down the clock of ticking down for the 2-hour time frame. So even if they open up the case at 2 a.m. on Saturday, it's going to expire at 4 a.m. So if you want to be able to control that to only be available during your business hours, you could define that through the customer service schedule and then associate that with this SLA. So for example, if you define that your business hours are from 8 to 5 Central Time, only Monday through Friday, even if that customer created the case on the weekend at 2 a.m., that SLA would not start until 8 a.m. on Monday and would expire at 10 a.m. Central. Next, I'll demonstrate creating the first SLA item for this SLA. So first I'll give this a name, and you can see that there's a related case field. This is what's going to get populated based off of this SLA. So if I leave this set as first response by, based off of what I calculate here, such as 1 hour after the case creation on, it's going to populate that first response by date time. Also, I can see any of the other available date time fields. So if I create any custom date time fields, those would show up here as well. So for this demonstration, I'm going to leave this as first response by. Later on, we'll create one for resolve by. Next thing I need to look at is the applicable when section. So I can define when this specific SLA item is applicable. So I called this one first response high priority because I want this one to be specific to cases that are set to the priority of high. So to make it match that, I'll go to choose priority, choose equals, and choose high. So that would mean that any case that does not have priority equal to high would not meet this condition, and this SLA item would not be applicable to that case record. For success criteria, I need to define what is the criteria that needs to be met for this SLA to be considered successful. So in this case, I call this first response. So what I'm going to do for the success criteria is choose first response sent. I'll choose equals and yes. Next thing I get to define are the SLA item failure actions and SLA item warning actions. First though, I need to define when do I want to consider this a failure. So if I leave this as 1 hour, that means that that first response time for any high priority cases needs to be completed within 1 hour. So if it was 1 p.m. today that I created this case and it was high priority, it would automatically set the first response by to 1 hour from the current time. Also, I have the option of warning at a certain interval. So before it fails, I can choose to warn at a certain period. So that's optional, but I could choose to maybe warn before it gets to the failure. And you'll see I have the option to define which actions I want to happen when it's at the warning point or the failure point. So for this particular item, I'm going to leave it with the default values. Notice that the failure actions area and warning actions don't show anything yet. I need to save the record before those become available. So once I've saved this, I see that now I have the ability to add different steps for the failure action section or warning action section. So this is based off of workflow, so you'll see some of the similar capabilities to be able to do things like sending an email, creating a record. So I could send an email to the case owner, maybe copy their manager. I could create a new record such as a follow-up task. I could update a record such as setting it to escalated is equal to true. I could assign the record maybe to a different queue such as an escalation queue, or I could change the status. So although it's pulling these as some of the actions that are available from workflow, and it's using workflow behind the scenes, I don't see all the different actions that are available. For example, with workflow it is possible to create custom actions, but those will not display here. It's only these 5 actions right now. So for this demonstration, I'm going to use update record. I'll choose to update the case record. I could update any of the related objects as well. Here I'm going to click set properties. I kind of see what looks similar to the case form layout. And underneath additional details, I'm going to switch escalated equal to yes and save that. Okay, I'm going to save this. I'm not going to do any warning actions. I could do that, but for time's sake, I'm going to save it how we have it right now. So now that I have that SLA item created, I could activate this, but it would only apply to cases that are high priority, and it's only calculating the first response by. So if I want to have this apply to additional cases that aren't just high priority, and if I want to calculate other things such as resolve by, I need to create some additional SLA details. So I've created another one that I'm going to use for first response by again. This time for applicable when, I'm not going to add any conditions. I want this to kind of be the fallback if the priority is not high. And for success, I'm going to have the same success criteria. And maybe only for high priority cases I want it to be a fast response time such as 1 hour. If it's not a high priority case, I might want to change this to something like 4 hours. And instead of warning at 30 minutes, I could warn at the 2-hour period. Another thing to be aware of is that this dropdown is only showing you some free options that are already pre-created, but you can type in your own numbers. So if I wanted 2.5 hours, I could do that. And I could choose save and close. So now I have 2 different SLA items and they're both for response by. And what you see here is that you do have the ability to order these, and the order does matter. When a case gets created and this SLA is applied, it's going to look for the first one that meets that condition. So for this one we had the condition of high priority. So if the case was high priority, it would use the calculation based off of these settings. If it wasn't high priority, it would fall back to using this one. So the order does matter. If I switched the order here, if you recall, that default one did not have any conditions in it, so any case would always meet the criteria for that one. In that case, the one I created here for high priority would never be hit by any case. So you do want to make sure that you have those set based off the correct order that you want to use. I want to add one additional SLA item to calculate the resolve by it. For time's sake, I'm going to leave this to apply to all different cases, but you could use it to differentiate based off of priority or any other conditions like we saw for the first response by. I'm going to switch the related case field to resolve by. So if I have this set to something like 2 days, it's going to calculate 2 days from the created on, and it's going to set the resolve by to that date and time. For the warning, I'll switch this to 1 day. The other thing I haven't done yet is the success criteria. So for this one, since it's for resolving the case, I'm going to choose status equals resolved or canceled. I'm going to hit save. Next thing I'm going to do is add some failure actions and warning actions. Just for quick demonstration and in relation to one other thing related to SLAs and how you can visualize those through charts, I'm going to demonstrate how you can update the SLA resolved by status. So I have this resolved by status field, which is a new field introduced with this release. When it's going to be failure, I'm going to choose to switch this to non-compliant. Hit save and close. And for warning, I want to do something similar but switch it to nearing non-compliance. So later on I'll demonstrate how you can see that then within your charts within your dashboards. Hit save and close. The next thing I need to do is activate this SLA. So even though this SLA is now active, it's not going to be applicable to any cases yet. There's two different ways that an SLA can be applied to a case. So one way that a case can be applied to an SLA is through an entitlement. If you learned about creating entitlements, you saw that when you're creating an entitlement, one of the fields that you can populate is an association to an SLA. So if I created an entitlement for standard support, I could associate this standard SLA with it. And that would mean that any customer that opened up a case with that type of entitlement would get this type of SLA. There could be another entitlement for something like Premier support that maybe has a different corresponding SLA that maybe provides faster response times and faster resolution times. So that's one way you can do that and be able to differentiate the SLA based off of the different entitlements you provide. Another option is set as default. You can only have one SLA set as the default, and basically the way that's going to work is it's going to function as a fallback. So when you create a case, if it's associated with an entitlement, it'll look to see, does that entitlement have an SLA associated with it? If it is, it'll take that SLA. If there is no SLA associated to that entitlement, or the case doesn't have any association to an entitlement, it'll fall back to using whatever is the default SLA. So if you don't use entitlements at all, and you set an SLA as the default, basically that SLA would apply to all cases that are created. Next, I'll demonstrate creating a new case record, and we'll see how this SLA gets applied. So remember that with the priority of the case is high, the failure is going to be at 1 hour, and if it's not high, then the first response by is due within 4 hours. Let's switch to service. If I leave the priority set to normal, it'll use that 4-hour duration. You'll see when I click save, the first response by is set to 4 hours from now, and the resolve by is set to 2 days from now. If I switch this to high and save it, you'll see that it recalculates that SLA to be 1 hour from now. So for this next demonstration, I'm going to show using an SLA with an entitlement. So I deactivated my previous SLA and I renamed it to Premier SLA. When I deactivated that, it automatically turned it off from being the default. I reactivated it, but it's still not set as default. So that means that this SLA will only be applied through an entitlement. So I'm going to switch back to Service Management. I'm going to look at Entitlements. Open up my Premier entitlement for AdventureWorks. You'll see that I've already changed the association so the SLA field is associated with this Premier SLA. Now I'm going to switch to the account record. And here I'm going to click to create a new case. I'm going to choose that entitlement. Click Save. And you'll see that through that entitlement, it did use that SLA that was associated based off that entitlement. If I would have created a new case that wasn't associated to that entitlement, an SLA wouldn't have been applied unless I had another SLA that was set as the default. The next topic we'll review is how to troubleshoot SLA. One important thing to keep in mind is that the new SLA feature, along with some of the other service-related features that are new with this release, such as routing rules and automatic case creation, are based on workflow behind the scenes. So even though you might not see those show up in the processes area, it is using workflow behind the scenes. So there is one area where you can still see this, and that's where when you're looking at a record, such as a case record, when you click the drop-down next to the record name, you'll see the relationships appear. And one of the relationships is to background processes. And when you choose that option, you'll see the system job associated view appear. And that'll show all the different workflow processes that are running against that record. One of the things to keep in mind is that any of the processes for SLAs that have been completed successfully automatically get cleaned up. So you'll only see something here if the workflow is not completed or it's doing something and hasn't finished. So if you do see something that shows up as waiting and you think that there's no reason for it to still be in the waiting condition, you can double click on it to see the details. So if this process really was waiting on something, you'd see a spinning status indicator right next to the condition it's waiting for. If something did fail though, you'd see something similar to this where a red X would appear and it would guide you down to the last step that failed. Here you can see that the bottommost red X is on the update entitlement step. You can see that there was a step before that with a green check mark indicating that that was successful. So it successfully updated the case, but it failed to update the entitlement. And what I did to reproduce this scenario was I created an action within the SLA actions to go ahead and try to update the related entitlement. And then I created a case that didn't have an entitlement associated, so it fails to find that entitlement and can't update it. And that's what this message at the top indicates too. It says, a record required by this process could not be found. So that message going along with what failed here helps me understand why that failed. I could go and look back at this record and see that that case didn't have any entitlement associated with it, and that's why it failed. Also, you don't see it on this slide here, but if you scroll down further, there's another section for details where you can expand that, and you can see the error message with the call stack of the failure that occurred when that update step failed. Let's take a quick look at how you can view those processes that are running behind the scenes for the SLA. Here's a case that was created previously, and an SLA is applied. It's still waiting for the first response by and resolved by. The conditions have not been met yet. So I can choose to look at the relationships for this case record, and I can see background processes. I can see that there's two rows, one for the first response by and one for resolved by, both showing a waiting state. And if I'm not sure if these are really waiting, I can open them up to see what it's doing. So here I can see that there is a spinning status indicator indicating that it is currently waiting on this condition to be met. So on this screen you can see all the different logic that was put together when you created that SLA item. So this was that first response -default SLA item that was created. We didn't create any applicable when conditions because we had a different one that was checking based off of priority equals high. So if we were looking at the other one for the high priority cases, we would have seen that the condition was looking for cases only that have the priority equal to high. Then you would see it was checking to see if the first response sent was set to yes. If it was, that would have been successful and it would have stopped processing at that time. Since it hasn't been set to yes yet, it's waiting for that warning time period. If it gets to that point, it would trigger any of the different actions that were defined unless the success condition is met first. Then it'll eventually get to the time it calculated for the failure time, and if that happens before the success condition is met, it'll trigger all the different actions for the failure actions. So you can see kind of the logic that was built in here. If I scroll down, I'll see that there is a details section, and this is the section that was mentioned before where if there was a failure, you could expand this and it would show you the error message, all the error details, including the stack trace. Also at the top you would see a small helpful message indicating maybe that the record could not be found and that's why it couldn't process that action. So here everything's continuing to work. You can see what it's waiting on, but if it did fail, you'd see the red X's that would lead you down to what failed, and you could use the message details section to get a better idea of what exactly caused that to fail. So I'm going to close out of this and I'll show you one last thing. If I switch the priority to high and click save, it's going to cause it to reevaluate those SLA items. And we did have one that was for priority equal high, so I should see that the first response by has been recalculated now to 1 hour from the current time. Also, if I go back to look at the background processes and refresh this, I should see that those previous SLA items were canceled because it had to reevaluate that based off of the change in the conditions. So these will get cleaned up automatically in a moment, but I can see that it's now waiting on the first response high priority. And you can see that if I open up this record, I can see the first condition of this one was checking if the priority is equal to high before continuing on. Because that condition was met, it stayed within this SLA item and is now in progress.